This webinar is focused on what I often call essential mysticism. And by that I mean that aspect of spiritual understanding that focuses on the most universal and essential elements of spiritual experience. That would be in contrast to, say, well, one term for it would be relative wisdom, and an aspect of which might be the whole sort of spiritual psychology of understanding spiritual qualities, understanding the challenging aspects of our nature that we need to gain insight into and to heal and transform in order to realize a deeper state of wholeness. Understanding karma, understanding the various forms of spiritual practice. This is another area that is also, of course, important, but there's an aspect of spirituality that has more to do with getting into the deepest essence of the nature of reality, our own nature. And for lack of a better word, sometimes I refer to that as mysticism. That word, of course, is used in a variety of ways, and so it's subject to different interpretations. But yet another, like those, so this, in a sense, these two facets of the Dharma, a more relative level and a more essential level. The third area would be, we could call it almost like the esotericism or the intuitive science. Of course, in a sense, they all overlap, and these are just different ways of looking at the same reality. But this area would be more like understanding bodies and chakras and kundalini and the different types of worlds and the cosmology of like a planet and what makes up a planet and the different kingdoms of nature and spiritual kingdom. So that this aspect of spirituality can be very vast and complicated. But the other two are in a sense the foundational aspects of the path. And sometimes people even kind of leave the deep mysticism as not necessarily an unimportant aspect of the path, but some approaches kind of leave that to be discovered experientially and don't talk about it at all, or don't talk about it very much. And I think that, there's a powerful value in that. The Tao Te Ching begins with saying the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. There's an aspect of deep mysticism that has to do with states that you can't really understand unless you have a strong experience of them. And so some traditions sometimes lean towards just leaving that unspoken, and you discover that for yourself. Another point of view is that actually that dimension of reality is very rich, even though it deals with essences. There are many ways that we can come to that experience with, in a way that still brings a personal flavor to it that can bias that. And so an aspect of the whole process of deep awakening, deeper stages of enlightenment, is we learn to uncover these biases and to let go of those and move into more profound and subtle levels of self-realization, of God consciousness. So one of the values in the teachings about transmitting this is that practitioners over many thousands of years have explored these realms, there's a lot of collective wisdom available about ways that people can get sidetracked or misunderstand, enter into kind of false views. Their realization might be relatively deep, and yet there's still a bias, or they can get off track in some direction. So this is one of the most important reasons to actually talk about it, is that there's a danger, of course, in talking about it, because it ultimately transcends language, and even transcends, ultimately in its deepest dimensions, it transcends ordinary human concepts. But at the same time, those very same concepts can be used in a positive way to make sure that we don't, in ways that we don't see, that we don't get sidetracked. And these these kind of biases or misunderstandings or getting sidetracked actually can have very significant implications. They can affect our lives. They can affect the levels of realization that we can attain. They can affect even the subtleties of how grounded are we, for instance. How do we relate to each other? How do we relate to the world? So there's a way in which the deep intuitive subtleties of our understanding of reality and ourselves has implications. It affects our human nature. It affects the way our enlightenment integrates into our human nature and with the world. So my view is, I don't lean so much, certainly not strongly, in the direction of not talking about it. I feel like we need a middle path. There's a certain amount of, obviously, experiential realization as the goal. But it's important to also include some discussion about it to not only accelerate and enhance our ability to access that realization, but also to avoid the pitfalls that can arise. At the essence, what we're talking about in the deepest levels of mysticism that we discover, and of course this is a matter of debate. If you turn to any particular teaching or lineage or even individual teacher, ultimately each practitioner has their own opinion about this. They'll have their own style. So you can group it into traditions or philosophies or points of view, but nonetheless, even on an individual level, within, say, a given tradition, you'll see differences of slight, That's because this fundamental mysticism is something that we're exploring that is so profound, so transcendental. And by transcendental, I don't mean, the way I define that word is not as something that's away from us, but simply something that transcends categorization. For instance, it transcends the categorization of saying that it's away from us. So it transcends that kind of transcending, like some philosophies say that God created the universe, but is remote and above the universe, like away somewhere in some inaccessible dimension of reality. My view, the way I define this term transcendental, is that reality, the deepest realization of God or the Tao or the self even, transcends that distinction of immanence and transcendence. It's even more transcendent than that, for instance. And that reality goes by many names, but in each of these cases, frankly, what you run into is, you look closely at Taoists or various schools of Mahayana Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, Plotinus, you will see versions of this similar philosophy. Some people call it non-dualism, but it goes by many other names too. Will become a little bit more clear as we go about what exactly that is. But in reality, each of these schools also puts their own spin on it. It's not like there's just a universal understanding that everybody shares, but it has things in common. one thing that core mysticism has in common fairly much across the board throughout traditions, whether they're people view the ultimate reality as a being, a god, a deity, or as something more more impersonal, like the Tao, something Nirguna Brahman, something more, or even in my view, just something that even transcends the distinction of personal and impersonal. And you can come at it from either angle or both. Because it's the ultimate reality there actually eludes making that distinction of personal and impersonal. Now, the ways that we end up talking about it, especially from our human point of view, can make it seem like it's something very obscure, something inaccessible, something remote. But actually, the realization of this reality is extremely intimate. It's possible, for instance, to do something like learn a very specific meditation practice and very carefully and patiently and intricately just learn how to uncover this state and enter into it in a very protected environment of the meditation cushion, and very intricately executed internal states. And that's fine, but that also continues to sort of give rise to the feeling that it's something remote. The reality is that the fullest kind of realization of this state is it's something that's completely available moment to moment in ordinary human experience. It's not something, it's so, in one sense, so different than ordinary experience that to our ordinary experience it can seem remote. And it might take, if we're not used to that state, if we haven't awakened adequately to it, we might need some very specific practice to learn to access it, and that's generally the way that that's done. But we don't want that to kind of give rise to a sense that it's something far away from our ordinary state. It's actually the very nature of our ordinary state, this reality that we call Buddha nature or God, the transcendent, is actually not different than our ordinary experience. It's just that we don't realize it. That's the only distinction. We don't perceive that. So there's this odd process that we're entering into in radical mysticism of this sort, where we're trying to discover a vantage point about something that's right in front of us. It's not, it is our own nature right here and now, and it's the nature of everything that we're experiencing. And we just haven't found that angle. It's like we have to discover, it's like it's like when we're trying to remember somebody's name. Somebody from childhood, and one day we're musing about that person, that relationship, but we can't remember their name. It's nearby, we can kind of sense it, and we'll know it if we get it, but we just can't grasp it, and suddenly we do. Nothing changed, other than we found that way to kind of come into grasping it. In a sense, that's the nature of awakening. That's the nature, it's a remembering. It's a moment of discovering how to orient ourselves and towards reality, where suddenly it all clicks into place and we laugh and we realize it was the nature of everything, including ourselves, all along, right here and now. So that's one of the ironic and paradoxical things about this most radical form of transcendental mysticism, is that it's about a reality that was never far away from our nature or our experience at any given time. It was simply a matter of perspective. Did we realize it? Did we notice it? So part of what spiritual practice is, and this can be looked at from a lot of different angles, but part of what spiritual practice is it's a path and a process of creating conditions that make noticing the truth, noticing reality, more likely, more easier to have happen. There's an odd sort of way in which the final step of directly realizing it is not something we can will to happen. We can't just grasp it. But what we can do is make noticing it, realizing it, much more likely. We can create the conditions in which that realization can take place. And it can be approached in a lot of different ways. It's such a rich reality that we can love our way there. We can use techniques to discover it. We can observe our way there. We can serve our way there. We can be devoted and surrender our way there. There's a lot of different ways to come into that relationship and discover that reality deeper and deeper, to nurture that. And each of them kind of has a style of feeling our way into it. But what happens is that because it's so universal, as we, whatever the path we use, as we move down that path, we discover a way in which all of those other approaches are ultimately different than what we're doing. They appear on the surface to be different, and they do feel that way for a long time. And ultimately, as we enter into deeper and deeper stages of any one of those paths, we discover it's deep interrelationship with all the other approaches. Now that's something, of course, that's easy to say. The actual realization of that and the actualization of that in our own experience can take centuries. We don't say start off, for instance, on a particular path and ultimately actually get good at that path and then suddenly become perfectly balanced in all the spiritual qualities and fulfill all the different approaches. That's, in fact, that's, to use the Buddhist term, that's in one sense what bodhisattvahood is about. It's a long, patient process that takes place over centuries of maturing into a full expression of all these approaches. Because if we want to be able to help people, for instance, on any path, we want to have some familiarity with that path. So ultimately, a method that those who embrace a path of whether they call it bodhisattvahood or world service, or you keep coming back into incarnation and having other kinds of experiences as well that just fill out their development and give them different points of view. In one life, a person might be very much say an explorer, following the path of observation and investigation and study and kind of reflective or investigative meditation or observing the witness consciousness, this type of thing. And then in another incarnation, that very same soul may be a devotee, a bhakti, and follow a path of love and devotion and surrender. And this way the soul is getting filled out and matured along a variety of methods. But normally people tend to lean towards one approach or a few and emphasize those angles, and then as they go into deeper levels of actual realization, they might start to broaden out at that point and actualize and explore the other approaches as well. So this particular approach that it's kind of most convenient, I find, to refer to it as non-dualism, because that's the term that's kind of essentially most popular today. One of the schools in Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, uses that term. The word Advaita means non-dual, essentially. And that's one of the ways in which this terminology has become popular, but it's also used in other traditions like Buddhism as well. That view is one of the most difficult to understand. It's a particularly radical form of mysticism, because it points to a reality that is particularly hard for the intellect to understand. One method, in fact, because of that, is to sort of use a process both intuitively and also sometimes intellectually of learning how to identify in our experience and in our minds ways that we're covering up this fundamental reality. And so by noticing these things, it helps to sort of let them go. In Hinduism, sometimes there's a term or phrase, neti, 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 and it means, neti means essentially not this. It's like a negation. So in a sense, the path of negation to discover this reality is one in which you investigate, you say, okay, in this moment of experience, I'm having a thought where I'm concerned about paying the mortgage, and I'm involved in worrying about that. And then that moment, you notice that you're having those emotions, those thoughts, and you essentially disidentify from them. You notice them and say, being caught up in that reality, that point of view, is not my true nature, and you let that go. The next moment, you have an itch, and you say, feeling this itch, this compulsion to scratch the itch, that's not my nature either. And you sort of back your way out of all the elements of ordinary experience, and then paradoxically discover a state of consciousness, a realization where you experience the reality that not only are you that, but everything that was arising was always that as well. So in that path, you kind of let go of things, you sort of back your way into God consciousness by letting go, neti, neti, neti. And inevitably, even if that's not your primary emphasis, that is an inevitable tool that we do need to have, and to some extent there's a process of moving forward, of embracing, of opening to, and there's also a process of letting go, of discrimination and noticing, and so even if one is on, say, the path of devotion, there's still a need to sort of draw one's energy into a focus on the object of devotion, a deity, for instance, and let go of all the distractions that are pulling our attention away from that. Something like a devotional path, though, is in a sense more affirmative. It's a path that kind of takes as something as an object to represent that transcendental reality. Most common would be, say, a deity. And then, let's say, since you're not experiencing that deity, you have to have some clue. So, for instance, you might have a name for that deity, or you might visualize some symbol that represents that deity, like a mandala in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is a visual symbol of a transcendental reality. A mantra is a name for that same principle. And by engaging those, that's a more affirmative process. But ultimately, in order to reach the deepest levels of realization, we have to mature our relationship to that reality. We can't stay fixated on a particular level, because that symbol is a doorway. It's not a final reality. And we need to ultimately transcend it. In fact, in Tibetan Buddhism and the deity yoga practices that use things like mandalas and mantras and so on, you ultimately enter a phase of the practice where you resolve that reality into the transcendent. So instead of staying fixed on it, you go beyond. This happened to Ramakrishna, the great 19th century Indian saint, who was primarily a bhakti for decades. He was a devotee of Kali, And he reached very profound levels of spiritual development in his devotion to Kali. But at one point, a teacher named Todapuri came into his life, and sort of invited him to embrace a more radical form of non-dual realization, Advaita, where he said, you know, Kali is very advanced, but if you go take it one more step, you can have this more complete self-realization or God consciousness, this transcendental form. And famously, Ramakrishna was reluctant. He said he kind of preferred to taste God rather than be God, and that he would rather stay in this more devotional state. But he turned to Kali in his meditation, and Kali said, you know, actually, in reality, I want this for you. And I brought Todapuri into your life to initiate you into this. So it's time, you know, you've gotten to a stage, it's right for another step. Ramakrishna was so advanced, of course, that he mastered this. Todapuri had spent decades mastering Advaita. I think it took Ramakrishna a few days. He just shifted his you know, his big heart and deep devotion to this new meditation, where he let Kali go and very quickly entered into Nirvikalpa Samadhi. In fact, this is a state where you just radically merge into an ineffable, unnameable, inconceivably vast reality. And he stayed, I believe he stayed in that state for 6 months nonstop, which is very unusual. They say that if you actually, in a meditative state, if you just merge all of your consciousness and energy into that state for more than 21 days, the body will pass away, because you've essentially kind of withdrawn your interest in being part of relativity, being part of this sort of ordinary conventional reality that we experience. So that was very radical, that Ramakrishna was able to sustain the state for such a long period of time. But then he kind of returned and re-engaged his ordinary human life. And so at one level, we have this radical transcendental reality, the non-dual, sometimes called in traditions like Hinduism, it's often called Nirguna Brahman. And the reason it's called Nirguna Brahman is because guna is a Sanskrit term for qualities. And nir means none or not, you know, like it's a negation, Nirguna. So Nirguna Brahman means that dimension of God, or the absolute, that is so radically transcendent that any kind of characterization or qualities or principles, or you might want to say, oh, it's the source, it's the cause, everything came out of that. Nirguna is a radical concept that says even that conceptualization is too small. We might want to say it's a loving being, and the Nirguna view would say, no, that's still too small. It's radically more than that. It's inconceivably vast. Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, once beautifully defined God as ever unreachable, ever beguiling, ever new joy, ever mysterious, meaning like it's not a reality that you'll ever be able to fully get a handle on. Like you can come into a profound relationship with it, to realize it tremendously changes your life, but it's an ongoing realization that never ends. There's a vastness to it that's continually eluding. That's one of the reasons I love the word mysticism, is that there's a mystery to this reality. And even though it's nirguna, even though it's something that can't be conceptualized, it can't be nailed down and boxed into some limited conception of what it is, it's something that can be directly contemplated and realized. We discover that it's intimately our own nature and the nature of everything that we're perceiving and experiencing and understanding. And to do that brings a profound sense of wholeness. Like we can't easily, or really ultimately, in the very sort of in the most radical sense, we can't nail it down. We can't say what it is. But the experience of realizing it in our relative nature as beings has an effect on us, and that effect we can talk about. For instance, the Hindu phrase Satchidananda attempts to do that. Satchidananda means transcendent beingness, consciousness, and bliss. Now, these are words, they're concepts, they're qualities, they're principles. And in that sense, they can't ultimately be a true description of Brahman. But they are a description of what we experience as we realize this transcendental reality. We become filled with bliss. Our consciousness becomes vast and transparent and unbiased, deeply realized. So we can talk about qualities like we become more loving and compassionate. We become much wiser. We become filled with bliss and peace and joy. But even those qualities can't fully contain that reality. It's even beyond that. But not in a negative way. See, one of the reasons that this non-dual philosophy is difficult is that because our ordinary human emotions and our senses and our minds have a familiar way of relating to reality, when we talk about this reality, and even sometimes in initial experiences of it, it can seem cold, it can seem impersonal, it can seem remote or aloof, but actually, again, if we look closely at what we're saying when we're characterizing these ways, these again are qualities and characterizations and concepts and feelings about this reality. They're actually not the nature of that reality. It's not cold. It transcends that idea. It's not remote. It's not impersonal. It's actually radically personal. You can't get more personal than the Tao. It is that reality that's most intimately the reality of what you are, and every little subtle nuance, every beautiful, exquisite reality of this moment that's arising is the Tao. No reality permeates and touches and embraces the intimacy of everything that's arising the way this transcendent reality does. So to enter it is to become, as they say in Zen, become intimate with all things. It's the most boundaryless embrace of all reality. So philosophically, when we talk about it, it can seem like, oh, that's boring, uninteresting, remote, impersonal. There's a lot of different kinds of reactions we can have to it. But what we're reacting to is our conceptualizations of it. It's not its nature. So one of the things that happens, there's an element to the spiritual path that's much like climbing a ladder, where we move from one stage to another. And very often one of the challenges is that when we're introduced to stages that are significantly different than the stage that we're at, then inevitably our intuition isn't matured enough yet, and our whole nature isn't necessarily matured enough yet to have an accurate perception of reality from that stage. And so if we're introduced to that, we'll often react to it. We'll invariably misunderstand it because we're filtering it through an earlier stage. And that's a very common thing, this kind of radical non-dualism. Even though paradoxically it's a profoundly intimate dimension of experience. When it's introduced, when we encounter it in earlier stages of the path, it's invariably misunderstood. So part of what we're doing is because one of the reasons that we kind of need to talk about this is because these ideas and all kinds of ideas about spirituality, about God, about the transcendent, about the non-dual have permeated our culture now. So we don't really have the option to not encounter these ideas and not work with them. So what we try to do is that, there's a number of very practical reasons to engage in this kind of process of exploring these ideas. One is very simple, is it helps orient us in the right direction. But also from a kind of scientific explorer point of view, it provides just concepts and ideas of a type of experience that just gives us options, gives us a kind of base of information and perspective, so that when we have experiences, for instance, I've talked to a number of people now in this life who have shared mystical experiences that they had prior to a time when they had any idea about what mystical experiences were. And that can be very confusing, actually, very disorienting. Sometimes there's an inherent feeling in a mystical experience of a sense of beauty or love or wholeness. But if those very same qualities come at a very strong, profound level, so much so that they go way beyond the person's current level of consciousness and ability to understand, those very same experiences can be disorienting. If an ordinary sense of self dissolves and a person experiences a radical sense of merging with reality, some people experience that as very disorienting and confusing. It's not in the nature of the experience for it to be that way. It's not inherently or necessarily confusing or disorienting, but it can be experienced that way if we're not prepared. So one of the basic functions of talking about essential mysticism is to prepare our personalities, orient ourselves to understand and be able to better integrate and appreciate those realities. Another reason is because in a very essential way, all of our souls deeply long to realize the state. Whether or not, and depending on how much we actually understand what it means, until we realize this level of reality, we'll suffer and we'll feel a sense of alienation. So what we're pointing to, in a sense, one reason to make distinctions about different philosophies and different paths and so on is to help to clarify that the reality is, if we want to really deeply enter into a full healing of our human reality of feeling separate, of feeling a sense of lack, a deficiency, a sense of suffering, that the final solution, you might say, the ultimate solution, is a deep spiritual awakening. There's no other way to resolve that existential reality of human separation and suffering. There is a level, though. What I've noticed is that there is really a level where that issue is resolved substantially, where having attained that level doesn't necessarily imply you have a particular philosophical style or way of understanding that reality. In other words, one person might conceive of the ultimate reality in very specific terms that, say, another person might disagree with. But both of those mystics can come to the state of individual liberation and wholeness in spite of their different interpretations and points of view. Because realizing that reality it's such a profound reality that we're coming in touch with, the Tao, that even at the stage of liberation or self-realization for a human being, it hasn't necessarily led to the need for a person to adopt a particular point of view about it. It can realized from a lot of different perspectives. And so you might get two people who are equally spiritually liberated and developed, and they might have fundamental disagreements about the nature of God or the Tao or Brahman. But one thing that will be the same is that they are in touch with this reality. And and the depth of their intuitive experience of that reality has led to their liberation. And then they'll still disagree about the finer details. But there's something, if you, instead of focusing on the differences, we could focus on the commonalities. One of the commonalities is there's something about this reality that deeply communing with that reality, investigating it, feeling it, opening to it, surrendering to it, whatever your approach is, even whatever way that you conceptualize it, it still leads to a state of profound wholeness, profound transcendence of a sense of difference, of separation. Some would argue, I said earlier, for instance, that there's a school of Hindu philosophy called Advaita Vedanta, or in English it would be non-dual. Advaita is non-dual, and then Vedanta, which is a reference to the Vedas. There's another school that in English would be called, instead of pure non-dualism, it would be called qualified non-dualism. And then there's a third major school that's just dualism. In the third school, there's a belief that there is a transcendental God that created the universe, and then creatures like us who can worship and be devoted to that being. But they could never experience that they're the same as that being. But such a person in that devotional state can get pretty far along the path of developing greater wholeness, greater soulfulness, even though it doesn't quite merge into radical non-dual realization. And the qualified non-dualist has the point of view that even though there is one transcendental reality, I'm always an individual, but that individuality is like a facet of the transcendental reality. So there's both individuality and universality at the same time. And radical non-dualism says, no, the ultimate reality is just the one without a second, the transcendental Brahman. And the experience of individuality is an illusion. You transcend that when you have the final realization of your true nature as Brahman. So you can have essentially saints from all of these points of view and lineages and traditions, and they can, even at certain stages, attain the same level of realization, and then they'll debate amongst themselves what the right interpretation of what they're experiencing is. So that's actually, I think, a kind of wonderful and interesting thing about spirituality is, on the one hand, there is a reality there that we're discovering. But if we were to kind of cast it in a scientific light, on our planet at least, one way to look at this is that my view is that we're not at a stage where it's kind of like in fields like physics, where in looking at fundamental realities, there actually isn't one point of view about the true nature of reality. There are a number of different points of view about these fundamental elements of, say, physics, like is it made up of strings? Is it supergravity? What is the nature of the most fundamental forces and realities in our physical universe? There isn't a point yet where, but all of these theories can have shed some light on things, and at this point, some of them have predictive value and can be used to understand in a limited way different parts of our experience and the exploration of physics. But in the end, around some of these very deep, simple questions, it hasn't been resolved yet. Well, in a sense, we have the same situation in mysticism on this planet now, too. There are quite a number of different points of view about the nature of God. And as a collective, we haven't resolved these issues yet. There's even traditions like Buddhism where there's several main schools, and then within those schools there's a lot of sub-schools, and one of the differences between those schools is their point of view about these realities, and to some extent they're not on the same page. There's the mind-only school or Yogacara school, for instance, of Mahayana Buddhism, and there's the Madhyamaka, which is the middle path school that people like Nagarjuna have founded. And they don't exactly agree about the nature of transcendental reality, emptiness, Buddha nature. So, in a sense, part of what I'm getting at is that that's fine. It's what's wonderful to notice about that is that there's some reality there that everybody's talking about. It's that old metaphor of the blind people and the elephant. There is an elephant. There is some reality, something that can be realized. And then there's the several blind people feeling the elephant, and one grabs the leg and says, I think the reality that we're dealing with is a leg. And somebody else is grabbing the trunk and they're saying, no, I think we're dealing with a trunk. It's the same elephant and people are relating to it, but they are having different experiences of what it is. That's the stage we're at with mysticism. We need to kind of accept the reality that there's a lot of points of view around right now. It's the same elephant, something's there, everybody agrees something's there, and to relate to it has this profoundly transformative effect on our nature. What exactly it is, when we start talking about it, what's the best way to realize it, what's the best way to conceptualize it, then we start getting into disagreements. And part of what I think we're moving towards in talking about something like an emergent dharma, new spiritualities, maybe it's valuable then to have a kind of spirit of loosening up about that and not being too sectarian, not being too dogmatic or focused be a little more open-minded, be experimental, investigate. The core then is our intuition, what is universally recognized, whatever the terminology may be, is that there's this deeper capacity in human nature that we all have, where we can open to more profound ways of experiencing life and expressing life, expressing our nature. And that through this thing, what we could call it intuitive, a more soulful way of being, a more beautiful, a more wholesome, a more loving way of being can be realized. And we experience reality, we experience our own nature, we experience the nature of everything around us, of other beings, of emotions and thoughts and subjective states, of the material world, and even ultimately the deepest realities, the most profound levels of reality. This intuitive capacity, which I'm just going to use that word in a general sense, this special quality of human nature to know and express from deeper levels of experience, seems to give us access as we cultivate it to this more expanded and deepening and unfolding reality. That's something that I think we find in many, many traditions around the world, some kind of recognition of that, whatever the style might be and whatever the terminology, the language might be, or the philosophy might be. It's all the same there. And so in that sense, there's this wonderful opportunity, but in the most broad sense, I would say, if you, for instance, don't resonate with the style I happen to be using of talking about this, my inclination and my hope is to share a style that, to me, is particularly universal and everybody can relate to, because I do feel like if we have an elephant and we have a bunch of blind people feeling different parts of it, can we begin to talk about why all of them are talking about the same thing? And it's just different parts of that same reality. So that's part of what I mean by a sort of emergent dharma, is one that really honors these differences and tries to kind of, and that's one of the beauties of a kind of what I call a more sort of radically non-dual perspective, is the less we try to nail it down to being something in particular, the more we're opening to a reality that it can include everything, including all paths. So it's my view, incidentally, that one of the reasons I'm kind of offering something that's, as we get into it more, I'll be more, get into the details a little bit more about my particular version of what might be called non-dualism. But part of both my experience of it and part of my motivation for sharing it is that it's my feeling that this is a way of experiencing that reality that opens us most fully to appreciating how all of the paths fit together. It's the deepest context for understanding a particularly universal approach and understanding of spirituality that embraces all kinds of different techniques. It provides that context for understanding various perspectives, various stages, various paths, various practices. It's the most radical foundation and context for that. So I'm going to come back to talking a little bit more about this non-dual reality soon. For now, I want to branch out a little bit and kind of do an overview of some of the other concepts and experiences that we'll explore during this webinar. So a basic distinction then that we find in a lot of teachings and resonates very deeply in my own experience is a distinction between what we could call the absolute or the deepest truth and relativity, we'll call it, because that's one of the terms that's sometimes used to describe. Now, relativity is a term that's used to describe states of consciousness and a way of experiencing reality where we're biased about that reality. We've entered into a particularly strong bias. Like if I say, for instance, if I become over-identified with a gender, with being a human being, a nationality, a racial type, a political position, it's fine that we, in some sense, that our identity is made up of a mix of all these kinds of things. But as soon as we enter a state where we say, this is what I am and I'm not that other, and we do that in a kind of very rigid way, and because of that, lack an ability to at least sympathize with or understand or have compassion for or relate to in some way the other. We don't have to fully agree with or resonate with another point of view, but can we include it? Can we shift our identity and put ourselves in another person's shoes and understand why they're the way they are, for instance? If instead we have a type of identification where my political views or my gender or my nationality becomes a rigid boundary, we're in what could be called a very relative point of view. We're looking out at the universe through a certain lens, a relative perspective. And there's other relative perspectives. So relativity is a term that's sometimes used to describe a whole dimension of experience that's made up of relative beings and relative points of view. So this is something that becomes a very, you see, as we get into deep mysticism, a basic question arises. We have this experience, we can have this experience of a transcendental reality. But then most of the time, most beings, not only human beings, but apparently lots of other life forms, seem to be in a state of consciousness where they're not realizing that fundamental reality. How did that happen? Why is that happening? And what is the nature of that reality as compared to the absolute, the transcendental. Well, that's a big can of worms getting into all of that. But there's a part of it that I want to talk about, which is just simply the distinction between those two. The distinction between the absolute, which again, by the way, I'm going to be throwing out these, I have been using these words like the absolute, Brahman, the Tao, Buddha nature, try to name it. Ultimately, all of these names are a little bit dangerous because they tend to have associations. So for instance, if I say the absolute, and I contrast that with relative reality, now it's dualism again, because we think we have an absolute and a relative reality. Does that mean that they're separate somehow? And that's, again, another challenging element to conceptualizing and naming these things. In essence, the difference between the two is that beings who are, let's say, identified with relativity, that's their point of view, are actually part of the absolute. They just don't understand it. So the difference between the absolute and the relative is they're one reality, but some mysteriously within that reality, there's two states you can be in. You can be in a state where you get your true nature, or you don't. But that doesn't change your status. So the absolute is actually the nature of the whole reality, and the relative is simply that dimension of the absolute that doesn't understand its own nature. But that doesn't mean that doesn't change its nature. It's still part of the absolute. Now, another debate that arises is, if you realize the absolute, do you lose your individuality? Now, that's a tricky one. We're going to come back to that later, but just in a nutshell, what I'm going to offer is a simple, thought. Since we can't name the absolute, it would follow, even just on a philosophical level, that we can't say that it's not the self, because that's still a conceptualization, and those are using words. Transcendental reality transcends saying it either is about retaining the self, or it's about not having a self. That's another, those are just two different dualistic views that complement each other. My sense and my intuition is that there's a way of experiencing non-dual reality that it transcends making that distinction. It's more subtle than that. It's less conceptualized than that, unless. So one way to try to talk about that is that, okay, it's both. In one sense, it transcends the self. In another sense, it doesn't. To try to articulate that, again, it's a difficult thing to explore in language, but it's worth spending a little more time with. So again, we'll come back to that later too. But right now, I'm just going to do a kind of overview of some of the main ideas. But this gives you a little bit of a taste of what my approach to these realities, just as a sort of starting place for those who want to explore in that context. Now, within the relative dimension of reality, there's an explicit sense of beings who, and in the relative, we have other dimensions of experience. We have things like the experience of time, the experience of space, of separation. We have mind and body. We have different worlds, like the physical plane, the astral plane. In a radical state of non-dual realization, it's not to say that all of that's not true, but it's seen in a new light. And it's realized as interdependent and interconnected and interrelated in such a radical way that we're liberated from experiencing a sense of suffering and conflict and alienation that comes from a more dualistic point of view about all of that. So enlightenment isn't about negating relativity, it's about changing our understanding and our relationship to it. So within relativity, there's two basic states. One is a state in which we're involved in a misunderstanding of reality. And the other is a state in which we have awakened to a true understanding or a deeper understanding, let's say. The latter sometimes is called things like enlightenment or nirvana. And both nirvana and its opposite, which in Buddhist and Hindu terminology is often referred to as samsara, both of these take place within relativity. The absolute, in its transcendent nature, has no need to awaken because it transcends all those experiences. But within relativity, beings can fall into ignorance and they can awaken. Ignorance generates all vast realities that we call samsara, and nirvana is awakening from that. But nirvana doesn't take us again away from anything. It's not some place that's different than here and now. It's just a different experience of the same reality. It's a different point of view. So we have the absolute and the relative, and we're going to clarify these things further as we go. This is just sort of an overview. The absolute and the relative, and within relativity, there's nirvana and samsara. And within the relativity as well, there's all kinds of other distinctions. There's galaxies and planets and human beings and vegetables and angels, and there's various planes. And so all of the realities, chakras, and all that vastness is part of relativity. Now, as we awaken to a fundamental mystical nature of reality, there's certain kinds of those awakenings that temporarily seem to pull us out of all that. We can lose awareness of our body, even our individuality, and merge into these higher realities. But more mature stages, there's a fairly widespread appreciation in many traditions like Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, various schools of Hinduism, Taoism, and even certain schools like Neoplatonism and so on, that recognize that the most mature states of enlightenment aren't those special states where we temporarily experience enlightenment by setting aside ordinary experience. It takes place in the midst of ordinary experience. It's a fundamental change of perception and therefore our way of being in relationship to ordinary reality. And so as that settles in, as that awakening, that transformation takes place in our human experience, a process begins that where it's as if the veils lift and we simply start to experience things that were veiled to us before, like, for instance, inner dimensions. It's not that these inner dimensions themselves are how we define enlightenment. For instance, having access to, say, the astral plane or the mental plane isn't in itself the nature of enlightenment, but it is something that happens as we become more enlightened, as a sort of secondary characteristic. And in fact, as our intuition grows through deepening spiritual development and self-realization, all of relativity becomes unveiled. And so in many traditions, East and West, where there's a rich appreciation of things like archangelic orders or chakras and elements and nature kingdoms and intelligences within nature and spiritual beings and inner worlds and all kinds of esoteric things like the subtle bodies that we have and all of that actually is a natural expression of mystical awakening, because integrated mystical awakening just unveils all of that. So one way to approach all of that is you can learn about it, and you can learn how to expand your intuition into experiencing it. And that's fine. Another approach, though, is to simply pursue a mature, balanced, grounded form of essential mysticism. And that process will unveil all of those realities all by themselves. You don't have to seek them out. You'll just start experiencing archangels eventually. You'll be able to see your chakras. You'll be able to see other people's chakras. You'll be able to relate to inner dimensions and all of these kinds of things just by pursuing a grounded, balanced form of essential mysticism. So I'm not taking a position there. Again, this is another just difference of style. Some people lean one way, some people lean the other, some people put them together. It's just pointing out that it's inevitable that will happen. And there's just different styles of how that will come about on the path. Now, another polarity within relativity is that since relativity is made up of dualism, if we go to the heart of that dualism, we discover a fundamental universal polarity that's part of the dance of how this relative dimension of reality actualizes. And if we experience an enlightened perspective about that fundamental polarity, and that's a key phrase there. If we experience an enlightened perspective of that fundamental polarity within relativity, that's at its essence, we'll experience these two spiritual qualities. In Hinduism, they would be called Shiva and Shakti sometimes, for instance. But there's different terms, other terms within Hinduism, and certainly within other traditions as well. So that's another thing that we'll explore more deeply is what is this reality, Shiva and Shakti? Why is it useful to understand that reality? What role can it play in our spiritual awakening or in our essential experience of enlightenment itself? And yet, another final reality that we'll touch upon right now before taking a break is I mentioned earlier that within relativity, there's two basic states, nirvana and samsara. Samsara is a state of alienation, of lack, of suffering, and of positive and negative states. It's a state of sort of oscillating polarities because of the dualism of our experience. We might have successes and then failures, happiness, suffering, life and death, disease and health. All these polarities come and go within samsara. It's all impermanent, it's all changing, it's all karmically influenced, regulated, so to speak. And then there's the state in which we don't reject experiencing any of that, but it starts to transform because we're looking at it from a new point of view. We awaken spiritually. So that's the state of nirvana. And the state of nirvana has two main dimensions to it. There are individual beings that have realized nirvana. And then there's a way in which there is a type of reality that we could call the universal personification or expression of all enlightenment that's happening in the universe. That's something that I often just call the universal Christ or the Adi Buddha. It's a being that's in a state of nirvana on a universal scale. And all of us are part of that being. We're all individual expressions of, if we have some degree of self-realization in that, we can, a version of that, a dimension of that, we can learn to open to, or just spontaneously open to, as the experience that enlightenment that we're experiencing is something that is experienced by other beings, and there's a sort of universal face to it. We can look into the universal reality of cosmic awakening. And in fact, that principle, that reality, can relate to us as well as an active intelligence, an active presence, filled with not only this universal wisdom and compassion, but a capacity to actively influence us. So we can invoke this being. I believe that that's the presence of this being in its many manifestations, its many forms, its many faces, is led traditionally throughout the ages to people's basic conception of an active deity, a God, a universal being, whether they conceive it as the author of the universe, or as a cosmic Christ, or a universal guru. Or, there's many ways of understanding it. But this is another dimension of universal mysticism. So these are the basic ideas, and one of the things I'd like to develop in this webinar is to go more deeply into each of these. There's a lot of subtleties involved, and as well as talking about practically the ways of intuitively experiencing these realities in our, not only in our inner practice, but ultimately in our day-to-day life. So let's take a break now. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do a meditation. Okay. That's a little bit of introduction to the meditation. Let me say that we'll explore a few different approaches in this webinar to meditation during our meditation phases of each meeting. The practices that we'll emphasize are what I often call essence practices, or essential or primary practices. And what that means is that you could kind of roughly categorize spiritual practices into two main types. Those that have a kind of more direct tendency to bring into our intuitive experience essential mysticism, or the more fundamental realities. So I call these sort of essence practices or primary practices. And the other kind we could call essentially, secondary practices, or something like that. That means that these are practices that have some specific function. It could be, for instance, like, let's say if we do a specific breathing practice that's aimed at smoothing out the energy in our mind and body by balancing our breath. That's a powerful practice to do, but it's kind of a bridging or secondary practice that's aim is to kind of lead us through a certain phase and bring about certain conditions in our mind and body. But it's not directly pointing to or opening to a more fundamental reality. But it can be a very powerful way to bridge to that. In fact, sometimes it's more powerful to do a secondary practice for a particular situation or stage than to do a primary practice. We'll actually move towards deeper awakening more efficiently by engaging in these secondary practices. So this term, and others like it, a secondary practice, isn't meant in any way to diminish the power and value of those practices. But when we're trying to cultivate a more direct, intuitive attunement and experience of essential mysticism, whether we come at it from a more, say, devotional angle or a more mindful or investigative angle or in some other way, there are certain practices that are more ideal for that. So those are the ones that I'll be focusing on in this webinar. First one is one that we've done a fair amount of, which is essentially a kind of, probably the tradition that has explored this approach the most is Buddhism. And it's the doorway to this practice is often the quality of mindfulness or bare attention, awareness. But in its fullest expression, it broadens into something much richer than that. But that's the essence. It's kind of an awareness-based approach. So let's do a sitting now that's focused more in that area, and we'll explore this more fully as we go as well. So entering within and taking a moment to settle down, become more fully present. Feel your body more fully. Allowing your mind and body to relax. Letting go. Be aware of your breathing. As you feel your body more fully, feel your breath. Feel yourself continuing to settle in and become more present. As you become more present, if you find yourself tending to become distracted, bring yourself back to your breath at your abdomen. Just feeling the sensations of your abdomen moving as you breathe. Not trying to do anything in particular with your breath, not controlling it in any way. Just feeling it, the sensations. So if you're finding that your mind is pulling away towards distractions, just use your breath to anchor it, to bring you back into the present. Letting go of concerns or plans, memories, distractions of all sorts. Just using the breath to come back. If you find that you're already adequately present, you can stay with the breath or expand your awareness to feel your whole body. Be aware of sounds, internal thoughts and sensations coming and going. Just being present. As you arrive more and more fully in the present, feel yourself becoming more content. Just being. Settle more and more into that contentment. Just letting go of any need for things to be different than they are. Notice how as contentment grows, your awareness gets finer, more present, more sensitive. Just continuing to be aware of whatever arises. But remaining present and aware, content. This is Satchitananda. Sat is beingness, is simple presence. Chit is consciousness, awareness. And contentment is Ananda. This is the tip of the iceberg. If you rest in presence and awareness and contentment, it will just naturally blossom into deeper and deeper realization of Satchitananda. If you become distracted, use your breath and body to come back, become present again. And as you stabilize your presence, just rest in contentment and presence and awareness. When you feel ready, open your eyes. This is a form of practice that, in one form or another, we find in different spiritual traditions from around the world. In the Buddhist tradition, the initial form that the Buddha taught, he called Vipassana. But as taught at that time by the Buddha, there's sort of various facets and dimensions to the practice. So learning how to kind of enter that state and to negotiate the challenges that can arise. It can be useful to look into some of these kinds of teachings, which I will be including not only in this webinar, but in subsequent ones where we continue this theme of exploring this type of practice. It's something that's central to both the way I practice and teach. There's a few other essential practices that I've worked extensively with and that I share also, and quite a few secondary practices. But this is a key essence practice that I've worked with a great deal in this, and even in the past. And it can be enriching to investigate different angles on it. For instance, because it's so basic to Buddhism, we find very rich teachings in the original Buddhist teachings that came from the Buddha, then sort of modifications and enrichments that have happened to it within the kind of old school Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, being that sort of remaining tradition that's rooted most intimately in Buddha's original classical teachings. But then in other traditions like Zen, in Chan Buddhism, and in Tibetan Buddhism, and other forms of Buddhism as well, Huayan, Shingon, there is essentially other forms of this basic kind of practice. But one of the reasons that it can be useful to look at the differences that exist is because even though in essence it's a very simple practice, it's not necessarily that easy to sustain. In its purest form, it's a quality of presence that is very alert and fully present to all dimensions of experience, so that, for instance, if sensations arise, we're aware of those. If thoughts arise, we're aware of those. Emotions, desires, memories, intuitions, even psychic experiences or anything that arises, we're fully, the essence of this practice, the deepest version of it is to be uniformly, evenly present to everything that's arising moment to moment. That's pretty difficult to do, actually, because it really requires a capacity to be to maintain a very stable state of presence. And normally, it's easier to cultivate accessing that through being more selective, like to, for instance, start with the breath and narrow our awareness down to the sensations of the breath and learn to become more present and concentrated on the breath. And then once we've stabilized that, we can shift more, include more, and eventually arrive at a state of this more integral presence that's profoundly open to all dimensions of experience at the same time. So what I just offered is sort of a little taste of a window into, we included the breath aspect because it's often difficult to do. But what we attempted to do is just kind of a glimpse of that more global state of presence, practice. In traditions, like one name for it in Zen is Shikantaza, or in the Tibetan tradition, another name is Mahamudra. But in each of these contexts, there's usually a kind of doorway to cultivating them, and often in the traditional Buddhist teachings and Vipassana, there's actually quite a rich teaching for learning various stages of accessing that state. And then more and more subtle and advanced stages of cultivation. So we'll come back to that more, as well as look at some other approaches. Before I go on, let me pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. I will turn on the microphones in case there's any, just to see if there's any questions people have about what we've talked about so far.
I do have a question, but maybe it's something you said you wanted to get back to later. I wrote it down. It's like, well, though we cannot say what non-dual is, do we have any qualities when we are experiencing non-dual? Do we have these qualities that we have gathered through many lifetimes? Do we in any way stand out when we compare ourselves to other people? Do you understand that?
When you say other people, do you mean people who are
in non-dual? Would there be differences from one person to another person in non-dual state?
Ah, yes, I see. Great, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. There we go. Yes. One way to talk about spiritual qualities is that they're both methods of spiritual development, but they're also the fruits of spiritual development. So that, for instance, let's say if we're doing a practice like we just did in the meditation of simply being present, there's certain qualities that I made reference to, like being concentrated, bringing ourselves back, being more present, and awareness and contentment. If we do a practice like that, and we emphasize those qualities, let's say we just happen to, in the full version that I teach, we would talk about other qualities as well, but to keep it simpler for this sitting, I focused on those, a few qualities. But as we did a quality like that, for instance, one of the things that we would start to experience and do experience over time is that our awareness will become more sensitive. And in fact, an interesting quality starts to arise where eventually, as the practice matures, and this becomes sooner for some people and later for others, but a kind of heightened enjoyment of just being aware of what's happening in the moment arises, where it's difficult to put it into terms because like a term like enjoyment seems more like a personality quality. But it's a kind of spiritual satisfaction and fascination with noticing even the most ordinary aspects of experience. Boredom falls away. A normal kind of habitual way of noticing things will say, okay, that's the sound of a car going by, I know that. As we go deeper, we go past that sort of the habitual way of perceiving things, and our intuition starts to blossom in a way that noticing things in the moment starts to become very fresh and sensitive and intimate. And it becomes very enjoyable just to notice the sound of a car going by. It's hard to explain why, but it's very alive. It's very fresh. It's very, and our awareness starts to become more penetrating and insightful about everything that's arising. Another quality that will arise is that we'll feel a pervasive sense of peace. And that peace can become extremely profound, where there's a deep, deep foundation of quietness. And that also, all these qualities interact with each other, so our awareness in the context of that great peace becomes not only extremely content and present and alert, but also very pervasive. It spreads out and becomes very finely tuned. And of course, our heart blossoms and we become more compassionate, more empathetic, more generous and loving and kind. So we can either use any of these qualities as the method. So for instance, I suggested attuning to contentment. If you didn't attune to contentment and you just, say, for instance, concentrated on your breath and just kept patiently practicing concentrating on your breath, contentment would spontaneously arise and you'd find yourself becoming increasingly peaceful and content. But you can also use the contentment as a way to access that and enter deeper states. So one way to answer your question, Britta, is to say that if a person, part of our sort of individual nature is that because of our history, because of our past, we might notice these things and grow in these different ways and be attracted to cultivating our spiritual development in ways that reflect our own individuality, our own history. And that's going to kind of stay with us as we open into deeper and deeper states. So even upon attaining deeper levels of non-dual awakening, the way that we'll individually give expression to that and just be with that will still be conditioned by our individual history. So if we were, say, more loving and devotional and follow the path of surrender and trust, and that's still going to be a quality that's dominant in our nature after non-dual realization. And that's part of the difference. That's one of the reasons we talk about that there are more advanced stages after non-dual awakening. Whether we call it God consciousness or theosis or harmony with the Tao or what have you, there's a sort of universal portal that we pass through, and a net effect on our experience of passing through that portal is that we stop experiencing ourselves as separate. In my view, that doesn't mean we can't experience a sense of individuality. Some people philosophically and experientially, they feel that it necessarily means that individuality ceases. For me, it's the separate sense of a self that ceases at that point. And subsequently, we experience what could be called nirvana, or profound liberation, or enlightenment, or peace that's reached a point where that's no longer an issue. There's no longer a sense that I'm suffering as an individual being because I experience a sense of separateness and frustration with life, or I become attached to something and then I lose it, or I desire something and I can't get it, or I wish certain things weren't happening but they are. All of that falls away. Deep contentment is one way to understand, like when contentment's brought to full development, we become so pervasively content in all situations that we don't personally need things to be different than they are. We might feel compassion for others, for instance, we feel an inspiration to serve the universal awakening, helping other beings to attain what we've attained. But we don't feel a personal sense of lack or agitation or worry or concern or attachment or aversion or judgment that leads to, as in our symptoms of, the sense of a separate self. So having attained that, we might have come to that, say, through a path of wisdom and investigation and witnessing and mindfulness. And that leaning will still be part of our nature. So such a person, like I've encountered people, for instance, who emphasize that more, and you could tell in their nature, even though they were deeply awakened, that they were very devotional, but the wisdom side was less developed in them, or vice versa. Or some other quality, like the technical quality of being, a master of an ability to kind of, one of the things that we can do is we can say, in the non-dual state, how would our mind and body operate as a system? What shape would our chakras be in? How would we breathe? How would the elements manifest in our bodies? And what kind of relationship to each other? And then we can use techniques to arrange our mind and body to be more like that through breathing practices and various other kinds of visualizations and active techniques to create the conditions that simulate what the mind and body look like naturally in a liberated being. And that accelerates bringing us into the state. And as our mind and body are brought into a closer and closer reflection of that state, it creates conditions in our mind and body where we realize our true nature. So we don't even have to be thinking about that too much if we just use these techniques to refine and purify and integrate and harmonize our bodies. These truths will just dawn on us. We'll realize things because we have created the conditions for that realization. So there's a variety of ways. And once attaining realization, we'll still have that leaning. But part of the meaning of subsequent stages beyond that is that we can grow in our expression of the other qualities and natures that are also inherent in all of us. All of us have these facets that reflect these different styles. One way of looking at it is the chakras. Each chakra is like a path in itself. A traditional way of thinking about the chakras is that there's a Kundalini energy and we awaken it in the root center and it rises up, and that kind of gives the point of view that the higher chakras are the better ones. But there's another more tantric point of view where it's almost like you could take the chakras, instead of viewing them as, I don't know if you can see my hands, top to bottom, we can turn them side to side and lay the chakras out this way and say, any chakra can be a pathway to, so any ray, any element, any body, any plane, any chakra can be a doorway or path of self-realization. We see this reflected, for instance, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where they talk about 5 elements, and then if you follow along that path, and they correspond to 5 major chakras. One of the main systems in Tibetan Buddhism is looking at grouping the chakras into 5 instead of 7. They also use 7 sometimes as well, but that's a more common one, is to talk about 5, and there's a reason for that. But that also leads to 5 paths, so there's 5 types of awakened beings. And so even upon achieving deep stages of liberation, there are bodhisattvas who kind of specialize in those paths. That's one of the reasons we have masters in the Trans-Himalayan tradition that are on so-called different rays. It's the same thing. All of those masters have achieved self-realization, but they still reflect their karmic history and the various factors that contribute to why they have the leanings that they do. And as they progress on the spiritual path, whether you call it the path of bodhisattva, that are just, I think there's a phrase that one Tibetan used in the early 20th century, the way of higher evolution. And this refers to post-liberated stages of development. And in those stages, all of these qualities become increasingly balanced in the person. So in somebody like, great planetary masters, these distinctions between different qualities become less and less in them. Another part, if I'm hearing it right, Britta, to your question is maybe something to do with how do these qualities exactly relate to the non-dual state. One important reality to understand is that these qualities, on one level, because we can name them, in that sense, they're no quality in and of itself is a whole or perfect description of the enlightened state. Nonetheless, each of these qualities is like a doorway to higher realization, higher beingness, higher consciousness and living, spiritually speaking. And so a way to understand how that is it's as if the qualities are an expression of enlightenment. If you attain self-realization and maintain that state, it's natural for not only these qualities to have manifested as how you get there, but they keep growing in their manifestation. So the higher stages of enlightenment, past liberation, these qualities actually keep growing in our manifestation on the world. So not only do each quality, the other qualities that are less developed in our nature grow more and more in our expression, but all of the qualities keep deepening. So in a sense, we could say that at the heart of every quality is non-dual realization. If you go deep into love, if you go adequately deeply into realizing the nature of love, you'll come to non-dual realization. If you go into devotion, you find non-dual realization. If you go into wisdom, you find non-dual. If you go into the path of technique, or even the path of karma yoga and just living with full presence in day-to-day life, any of these pathways lead to non-dual realization. So you might say that the essence of all qualities is non-dual realization. And one of the things that invariably happens is as we go into that quality, let's say we're particularly inclined to the path of devotion. As we progress on that path, because of the non-dual nature of reality, as we go deeper into that path, that quality will become more non-dual in our experience and expression of it, so that gradually all of the other qualities will realize in our nature, because they're all interdependent ultimately. And so what non-dualism does is it brings out that interdependence. It nurtures and manifests. So in a sense, what the more advanced stages of any quality are the stages where we are experiencing and actualizing the reality that we can't actually keep going deeper into that quality without manifesting all the other qualities, because they're all just different facets of the same reality. And that's why the most advanced masters basically are very deeply balanced in all the qualities. So an example of this is in the Sant Mat tradition, which is a path. Sant Mat means the path of the masters, and it's a term used in the Sikh tradition for the path, of the yogic path of mysticism. And the essential practices taught are meditating on subtle light and sound, nada yoga, and meditation on inner, you could call it like jyoti yoga or something like that if you want to use the Sanskrit. But the core practice is nada yoga, which is meditation on the subtle sound that can be heard. As we grow spiritually, we begin to hear this inner sound. And that nada, that inner sound, can be worked within a variety of ways. It's another form of essence practice, because in the same way I was saying that if you just do this kind of presence or mindfulness-based meditation that we see very prevalent, for instance, in Buddhism, it will take you all the way to the deepest levels of self-realization. It's what the Buddha apparently did in his final phase. He had done a variety of practices for several years, and then he discovered the practice of just sitting. He called it Vipassana, and that led to the final stage of him realizing Buddhahood. That practice can take a person through every stage, and it's something that integrates into day-to-day life as well. One of the powers of that practice, by the way, is because it's not an internalized practice. Like, for instance, listening to the sound current, a common method of doing that is you do it in such a way that it causes eventually one to lose awareness of the physical world, and because as a certain amount of healing and transformation has taken place in the body becomes very still and blissful, and when one temporarily loses awareness of it and becomes more focused. It's a very soulful state, but our body aspect will be more astral, a finer bodily level of experience. And if we keep doing the practice, we'll move to the next plane and the next plane. In a sense, kind of developing purity and awareness and equanimity in each plane in turn, balancing our experience of each plane as we go, and in a sense working our way inward till we transcend all the planes. So in that system, there's a devotional quality where we listen to the sound current as sort of like the vibration of deity. It's the manifestation, it's logos, the word, vibrating throughout the universe and in our own nature. And so we listen to this sound. It's the primordial Buddha, it's the universal guru, it's the universal Christ, however we best relate to it. Any deity, if we think of, we're devoted to Kali or to Tara or to Avalokiteshvara, however, whatever the tradition we're part of, we can experience that way through whatever lens that we want. And at a certain stage, as we're moving through deeper and deeper levels of transformation and awakening and unification, we come to a certain plane, one of these inner worlds, and at which point we merge with God, or the Sat Purush, they call it in the Sant Mat tradition, or Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities, Brahman, God with having qualities like love and presence and wisdom and power. But then if we keep doing that practice, we'll go beyond even God as a being into radical non-dualism. So this is an example even on a devotional path. And so the term they use is the few more finer planes in the Sant Mat tradition beyond the Sat Purush, and which ultimately resolve into a state they call anami. And nam means the word, the sound. That means God with qualities, God with characteristics, God with a name. It's a super subtle name. It's the universal music. It's the song of God. It's the title of the Bhagavad Gita. It's the song of God. So you learn to feel God's presence as a universal tone, and you follow that name into merging with God. And then God, as a being, leads you into its deepest nature, which is anami, beyond the word, beyond form, beyond qualities, beyond presence, into something even more radically transcendent. So that's an example of this idea that I'm describing, where any path, if pursued with the right understanding, can take you all the way into the deepest levels of non-dual consciousness. And similarly, and in a sort of like conversely, you might say, to actualize non-dual realization within relativity takes the form, one of its symptoms, you might say, is the manifestation of spiritual qualities. So as we cultivate this deepening non-dual realization, all of these qualities inevitably manifest as a sign or expression of that development. So you could say that from a transcendently mystical point of view, the essence of enlightenment takes the form of something, of realizing a reality that is incapable of being described adequately by words or qualities or principles. But so that's the inner essence of it. But inseparable from that is a kind of actualization of it within the dimensions of reality that we can name and relate to and have form and qualities. And then that aspect of enlightenment expresses, among other things, as spiritual qualities, like love and wisdom, and passion and joy and bliss. And ultimately, as that realization becomes more and more complete and more balanced, all of these qualities manifest in a balanced and more complete way. So one of the ways that people, this is maybe a little bit subtle, but if, for instance, a person, just as an example, attunes instead of to a person's personality, if you intuitively attune to their soul, and you have enough background spiritually in these things, one of the ways that you can know a person is instead of by a name, for instance, that designates them, or even a persona, like their body that they have, like you see them so you recognize them. Since everybody's manifestation of enlightenment on a spiritual plane, like on a soul level, is unique. In other words, their specific expression of all of the qualities, it's like a mandala, that they're a living mandala that's a geometric configuration of a certain degree of balance and development of all of the qualities. And everybody is profoundly unique in that. So you can become so intuitive, adequately intuitive, that when you contact a person on that level, you know them by the geometry and balance of all the qualities that they are. That is them. And it's completely recognizable. And you contact somebody else and you know immediately that's a different configuration. And it's a very intimate and soulful way to know somebody. And at that level, you don't need names or bodies anymore to recognize somebody. You just know their configuration. And of course, it's constantly changing. They go through experiences, they go through incarnations, and that configuration's maturing. That's one of the reasons that I try to keep reminding people that, yes, there's these wonderful historical figures that we know about, like the Buddha, Jesus, Lao Tse, Padmasambhava, Krishna. But it's also important to keep in mind that all of those designations refer to incarnations and states of the evolution of that individual that in many cases were thousands of Krishna lived, they say, approximately 5,000 years ago. The Krishna that we know from sources like the Bhagavad Gita is not what this being is like now. They've evolved 5,000 years of spiritual evolution since that. The Buddha's evolved 2,500 years of spiritual evolution since that incarnation. So to really know the Buddha is not to know the Buddha through the lens of what we know about an incarnation that happened 2,500 years ago. It's to intuitively cultivate a relationship to his living presence now as a being in relationship to the earth, and know him for what he is now. The same for any of these beings. So that isn't to say that it can't be powerful to attune to some of these lives and sort of a kind of past image or understanding of them. But remember too that in terms of that being, that's the past. That's not the present. Britta, let me open up the Did I get a feel for the question okay?
Yes, though it sort of raised another question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, non-dual and being one with everything, I don't understand it as being the same. I think in non-dual state, you can realize being one with everything, but one with everything is not the same as being non-dual. Does that make sense?
Yes, but can you say what the difference is for you?
No. No, that's too much to ask. No, can't.
Okay. Well, I will respond to that anyway. Hopefully it'll be related to what you're talking about. Mute first. Okay. One of the things that we'll talk about in much greater length is the ways that we can kind of come to non-dual reality with a bias, with some kind of a relative slant, where we interpret it in some way or another. And there's a lot of kind of classic ways that people do that, even in philosophical or spiritual contexts. My experience is that invariably there are little biases that we can notice in ourselves or in other teachings, even whole lineages, certainly individuals, where there's a tendency to sort of favor, because you know, we say that you can't talk about it, but we still end up talking about it. So when we talk about it, that becomes a type of model of what we think it is. And so we might as well sort of own the idea that we are talking about it, so that we can try to do as good a job at engaging in something that's ultimately, you know, kind of futile, because we can't ultimately talk about it, but kind of can't not talk about it too. So my approach to that is something that some people have called the middle path, where you try to construct a balanced perspective, where you don't go too far towards something over here or something over here. You say, well, it's kind of a balance and combination of things. And one of those is that a very common projection or interpretation of the absolute or the non-dual or God is to say it's the oneness. It's being one with everything, or it is the oneness. The reason that, well, of course, just on a philosophical level, we can say the reason that that's not truly an adequate description of the non-dual is because it's a word, and it's a concept, it's a characteristic, and the non-dual transcends all versions of that. Absolutely, there's just no exceptions. It radically transcends all these abilities. So what is the opposite of oneness? Well, two-ness or multiplicity, diversity. I would prefer to say that the non-dual is, again, it's a way of talking about it, so it's not perfect, but it's closer to the reality of the non-dual to say it's both. It's the oneness in the diversity. It's unity in diversity. One way that I actually am inclined to talk about that is that it's interconnectedness or interrelationship. In that reality, remember, relationship doesn't negate individuality, but it deeply affirms a sense of oneness or connection at the same time. So intuitively, it's kind of like a spiritual puzzle. Can I enter into a state where, even though to my intellect it's hard to kind of figure out what this means, but my intuition, my experience is, doesn't have a problem with these paradoxes. Intuition can understand how a person can be distinct and interconnected at the same time, one and two. There's a kind of more succinct way that Suzuki Roshi, famous Japanese Zen master who came to the United States in the 60s and 70s, lived here for years. He famously said, the true nature of reality is not two, but it's also not one. And that was his very simple way of pointing at the non-dual truth that it can't be captured by any of these words, even ones that seem like they should be able to, like oneness. And he was saying, no, if it's something you can conceptualize, it's too small to contain the true nature of reality. The nature of reality is radically complete, radically transcendent. So to put that in positive, Suzuki Roshi put that in negative terms. He says it's not two, and it's also not one. That's one way to talk about it. You can also do it in positive terms. You could say it's both one and two. Nagarjuna, the very kind of perfectionist Buddhist philosopher who lived about 1800 years ago, was even more precise about this. I won't kind of belabor what he had to say, but he really pointed out that even the negative version of saying it's neither of those, or the positive version of saying it's both, neither of those is true either. But from a more sort of human, grounded, practical point of view, we have to find ways of talking about it somehow. And as long as we stay aware that these are limited understandings, they're just tools, then I think we're safe. We can we can be safe from getting caught in them and just use them as a way to go into from that level of the understanding of them into a more profound, intuitive understanding. So I'm comfortable with just saying a fairly workable model of the non-dual that helps to point at it is, it's a state of realizing the interrelationship of all things. That, I think, has the value of it's a little more positive. It's not just saying it's not this, it's not this. But we also have to keep in mind at the same time that that's a pointer. It's not fully capturing the fullness of that reality, but it's a pretty good one in my opinion, and preferable in some ways to some other ways that we could talk about it, like a purely negative way of just saying it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. Then we end up, without necessarily noticing it, we're kind of using a path to get to it that still has an emptying out or negative quality, and that gives a spin to how we realize it. So we've got to balance that too. So that's part of the trickiness of opening to deep non-dual realization. And essentially what advanced stages of spiritual practice are is that we reach a stage where this transcendent reality, the Tao, Brahman, Atman, Buddha nature, comes actually within our own direct perception. And so we enter a state where we can, it's first in meditation, usually the way most people experiencing, and then later throughout the day, as well as in meditation, we enter a state where we can directly contemplate that reality. We are experiencing an intuitive contact with this level of reality, and in that state we have just endless possibility for contemplating its nature, and we keep refining and expanding and enriching our capacity to understand its nature. So it's not something we have to have it all figured out intellectually ahead of time or at any particular stage of the path. It's good to have a certain philosophical foundation to kind of orient us and to minimize the potential for getting sidetracked. Because you know how, for instance, we've heard about the notion, there's a term that's common these days, like spiritual emergency or Kundalini crisis, or with different terms that people are using these days for especially a kind of more energetic type of phenomena where our chakras are opening or the Kundalini is moving. And there's versions that are more normal and balanced, and then there's sometimes versions that can be more problematic. And they've given rise to phrases like premature Kundalini awakening, for instance. Well, in the same way that these are ways of acknowledging that there can be challenges that result from ways of approaching spiritual practice. Let's say if we do an aggressive form of breathing practice where we concentrate on our root center, we could open up that chakra and stimulate the Kundalini to start moving in our throughout our energy body in a way that's too aggressive and premature. And if we haven't done certain practices and come to a certain stage of development first, that awakening of Kundalini can generate problems. Well, in the same way that that's true, and many of us have heard about that before in a kind of energetic Kundalini, the same thing is true really in the realm of wisdom and insight and understanding. We can experience awakening in a lopsided way that can in part be a result of having a philosophy that's not balanced. And so we can approach or react to opening to deeper levels of reality in problematic ways, intuitively and philosophically, just as much as we can on an energetic level. And I've frankly, I've encountered quite a few people in my life who have these lopsided understandings of things like non-dualism, and it can significantly affect their lives. It can throw them out of balance in terms of things like how they perceive themselves, how they perceive others, how they perceive life, how they function in day-to-day life. So that's one of the key reasons why I feel it's important to have a good grounding and a balanced understanding of mysticism, in this case, non-dual understanding. I think there's time for a question. Sure. Let me turn the... Okay, question? Who was that? Linda?
Yes.
Want to ask a question?
Yes. To what extent is embodiment defined as inhabiting your body, and not just being aware of it, but actually inhabiting it? To what extent is that necessary, or I don't know. I don't know if that's an answer or a question actually, but
sounds like I would turn it into an answer and say that inhabiting your body profoundly is both a path to non-dual realization, and it's also an inevitable and necessary result of it as well. In other words, we're going to talk about this kind of middle path of balance, and that's, in a sense, we could say that's sort of the tantric style of looking at non-dualism, is that we approach it as a marriage of opposites, of a balance, of a middle path, which is based a lot on looking at polarities. And one polarity is mind and body. And many traditional non-dual paths, I should probably turn off the sound here. Many traditional non-dual paths tend to have arisen in the context of traditions or individuals who were more wisdom-oriented in their leaning, more mind-oriented in their leaning. And so their style of talking about it and even practicing it can sometimes show that sort of leaning. But for me and for many people, at least some people, the non-dual reality of our nature is not something that favors the mind or is best approached through the mind. It's a reality that embraces mind and body completely. And in fact, one way of talking about it is that it's the marriage of mind and body. And subsequently, it can't really be deeply realized, fully realized, unless well, to put it in the way that you phrased it, is the body is fully inhabited. The body has to be completely owned, transformed, embraced, loved, and balanced and integrated with the mind. And the same with the mind. In a sense, so therefore, one way of talking about that is, as long as we experience the mind and the body as two separate realities, and that we even think that there's a preference between embracing one over the other, for instance, that's not non-dual understanding. That's still dualism. It's a deep marriage and balance and integration of mind and body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does. It really does. And I think that in my own experience, from what I've had some more experience about inhabiting my body, it's like from that small experience, I can sort of, lean into what it's about, and, inhabiting the body and non-dualism. And there was a question coming up as well, and it's like, so I'm wondering, for those who are not talking about inhabiting the body, what are they talking about then? And why aren't they talking about inhabiting the body? Why I don't. It's both frustrating and really weird for me, because how can they talk about non-dual and not at all talk about embodiment? Sometimes I get crazy about it. It's like, what? How can that, be?
I agree. We will find, though, in a lot of the kind of more mature non-dual traditions like Taoism or Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, that whatever the terminology may be, the idea of embracing the body, of an integral and integrated state of awareness and being and presence, that fully inhabits both the mind and the body, or is seen as even marrying the mind and the body. We see that kind of way of talking, even if it's, might not use a phrase like embody, but it's still about the body and embraces the body and actualizes in the body very, very profoundly. But the styles may vary. And in fact, this is something that's very powerful and interesting to understand about a true non-dual path is wherever you may start. It's like climbing a mountain. You might start on one face and go up that side of the mountain, but as you get higher and higher, you see more and more of the whole mountain. When you get to the top, you can see the entire mountain. So people who go far enough on any particular path will embrace the whole thing. But if they started, let's say, more from a mind point of view, they might have to go a ways before their non-dual unfoldment embraces the body. So if they're kind of beginners in that path, they might not talk about the body or think it has anything to do with the body. But eventually they'll realize that. But the way that they came to that was through another doorway. But it'll come back around. But for me, I feel like since we know that it's going to lead to that, why not include that from the beginning?
Yeah, and for some it's necessary, right? To start with that, to start from there, I think it is.
And some people lean in that direction to begin with. So if we want to develop a truly full human integral path, if we don't try to use that language too, then those people feel like their path isn't being understood or acknowledged. And so
Can I ask a little question to that as well?
Sure.
So it's like when we say inhabiting, and when I feel this, slightly inhabiting thing that's happening, it's like I'm coming from the mind and inhabiting the body, and not the other way around. Is that right? Even though I can feel the marriage, or it's like, the start of a marriage, or there is a place where I'm coming from doing that. And is that from the mind? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I believe I do. This is the image that I would suggest. Let's think of the mind and the body as side by side and equal. And
yeah.
And then let's define soul as that part of our nature that's at some stage of realizing the marriage of mind and body. And we'll put that up here like a triangle. It's not down at the same level. It's like we tend to, in certain models of reality, we say, here is body, emotions, mind, soul. And it's like mind somehow in a model like that seems to be kind of more spiritual than the body.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, well, let's rearrange that. Let's put mind and body equal down here and put soul up here. And soul is what both inhabits mind and body.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay,
Yes,
and then the non-dual is like the ground of it all. It's not favors any of those, but it is realized more deeply by the soul. So we'll come back to that too, because that's a very important thing that we're talking about right now. But you know, we're running out of time, and I did see Tamara had a question too, so I want to.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tamara, did you have a question?
I printed a question because it's easier for me sometimes to write, to articulate my thoughts.
Oh, did you write it? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yes. Okay. So, yeah, that's an interesting distinction. You could even say that there are three conditions. One is we are non-dual, to use an imperfect word, as in our essential nature, but we don't realize that we are. Then there is a state of kind of growing into a condition in which we are experiencing a more non-dual state of realization. We're experiencing more non-dualism, but we might not really have clarity yet that that's what's happening. And so that's like a third situation, as we're growing in non-dual experience, and we're also understanding that that's what's happening more. Is that so far am I understanding what you're?
Yeah, I think that from my experience, it's the absolute is, it's like you know, that the metaphor of the fish not recognizing they're swimming in water, that the sense that it's ever present, but you don't recognize it's there. And so it's actually training in recognition more than anything else. Then that suddenly the recognition that it's pervades everywhere, it's everything and every, you know, and the sense that you suddenly recognize that it's always been there, seems to be an experience, versus there's this condition of duality, and then there's this other condition of non-duality, or there's this condition of the relative, and then that drops away. I'm not articulating it very well, but my sense is that I've had experiences where with a lot of pointing out that sometimes everything drops away, and you realize it's always been that way. Everything has always been completely natural and pure, and it's just that sense that it was always there and I didn't recognize it was always there has been an experience that I've had.
Yeah, it's kind of like being in college and taking a music appreciation course. We might have already enjoyed a certain kind of music, but then we take a course and we are enriched by additional perspective about the thing that we've been listening to already, but now we appreciate it more because we have some new perspective about it. In a sense, non-dual awakening is like that. We already are this reality, but we haven't noticed it yet. We haven't recognized it. And that's what pointing out is not pointing to something that's being cultivated or needs to be developed. It's pointing to something that was always there. We just didn't realize it. The same way that the music always had that richness to it, we just didn't appreciate it. And then we took a class and it got pointed out to us. Now we can appreciate it.
Yeah, one of my best metaphors that I've ever seen for awakening is from the movie of Helen Keller, where Helen Keller is a little girl and her teacher is trying really hard. She's both blind and deaf, and she's trying to teach her words by sign, but she has to sign through her hands and feeling her hands doing sign. And she puts her hands under pouring water and does the sign for water. And suddenly Helen Keller gets it, and she gets that she's been trying to communicate with her all along. And she gets that water has a name. And I feel like that's kind of a metaphor for this, like this recognizing that water has a name, that realization has to be pointed out to you somehow, like Helen Keller's teacher. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, I would make an important distinction that it's not so much generally that we have the realization, we just don't know it. It's more like we have that nature, but we don't have the realization. It's the realization that of our true nature that's missing. So we've always been Buddha nature. We just didn't recognize it. Recognition is the realization. It's that moment of aha where Helen Keller puts it together and realizes something.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This whole thing that we've been doing, it's signing, and I didn't get what it was about. It's about I can communicate with this.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that's a good analogy or metaphor too. I think that's one of the most powerful things about essential mystical awakening, is that it's not something that we developed, like, I didn't have this and now I cultivated it and now I have it. The realization is developed, but the Buddha nature, that is the thing that we realize, that liberates us to know that it's the truth, that was always there. It was always our nature. It wasn't a matter of cultivating our Buddha nature. Our Buddha nature was intrinsic from the beginning. It was, what was missing was the recognition of it.
So we're training in the recognition.
Right. And there's a variety of ways to do that. For instance, if we're not more grounded and loving in relationship to our bodies, for instance, then the conditions aren't going to be present in our mind or body to recognize it. So a stage in that process could be talked about as owning our bodies and healing our relationship to our body, for instance. So there's many different pieces ways that we can set up the conditions that provide the optimal situation for recognition. That's why in the Nyingma tradition, Dzogchen is traditionally the 9th out of 9 yogas, nine tantras. And there's many other practices, Nundro and outer tantras and inner tantras and secret tantras, that are used to bring one to a point where recognition is possible. Because normally what we find, we can sort of talk till we're blue in the face and say, it's right there. There it is, the sound of that teacup hitting the table, that's Buddha nature, that moment of perception of a sensation or a thought or a memory or even your essential beingness. That's what Ramana taught as his kind of essence technique, self-inquiry. But what he taught was, if you attune to a direct perception of the current sense of self, that's the tip of the iceberg, but that's a sense of self that's experienced as in a state of not getting its true nature. So just attune to it and keep questioning it. Question yourself, who am I? What is this sense of self? And that will take you through a process of peeling away all the false identifications till you finally recognize the truth. And that truth was always there from the beginning. You didn't create a new self that's now your Buddha nature self. you realize you peeled away your misunderstanding so you could get it. So there's this process that we have to go through. And when a person is ripe, they can have a direct introduction. They either through their practice and or through external support, they can be shown or experience that truth. But most of the time, I remember a famous story, I think it was of Patrul Rinpoche, who studied with Do Kensei, and it took him 18 years of preparation before he was ready for introduction. He lived with his teacher and practiced extensively, mandalas and all kinds of things, to get to that moment where his consciousness, his mind and body were right for non-dual recognition. Well, go back to the general view. Seems like a good place. Tamara, did you want to follow up at all with that?
No, I just had another slight observation. Am I still speaking here?
Yeah.
I felt that the practice that we did, the sitting, just the breath awareness and so forth, tends to feel somewhat isolated and individualistic. And my own sense of practice right now is opening to the greater field, bringing awareness in of the vast field of support. And it occurred to me that one can do the sense of sitting and breathing and feeling the vast field of support at the same time as one integrated practice. And or that perhaps that as one sits and breathes, eventually it opens up to an awareness of that vast field of support. And I was contemplating that, and I was wondering if you had any comments.
Well, I agree with both of those observations. You can both sit with one dimension of the practice and the others will arise, like that field of support that you described. And also, it can be an actively cultivated dimension of experience. So normally the way I teach it is both, includes both of those approaches, but from the point of view of the active aspect of bringing it in, it's sort of like that in a state of very deeply balanced, rich, actualized non-dual presence, there's actually a kind of core reality of foundational non-dual presence. But then on the relative level, there's a lot of richness and a lot of facets to how it actualizes. And so from a practice point of view, one way to open to that is to sort of add the pieces. Like, let's take this piece and we'll learn how to connect to that. And then we'll add this piece and then this piece. And then you kind of build a total state of integral presence. So the piece that you were talking about is another piece and an important piece. I just didn't happen to start there. I started with, in so many ways, I feel like our body is a very kind of foundational level of our experience. So to get present to our body, to the breath, being present is a good foundation. And then we can add to that. We can sort of build the state of presence from there.
Okay. So
yes, thanks for sharing that, and that's definitely true in my my approach as well, and we'll in fact explore that as we go.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, well, good place to stop. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all again, and I look forward to seeing you next week.